Welcome to South-South News. Today's special guest is Ambassador Gert Rosenthal, Permanent Representative of Guatemala to the United Nations. Thank you, Ambassador, for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you for having me.
Ambassador, so let's talk a little bit about what Guatemala is doing in reference to the Millennium Development Goals.
Well, I would tell you that the Millennium Development Goals coincide almost exactly with the priorities of Guatemala's own development plan, which is not a surprise because at the level of generalities at least, no country can object to defeating hunger and poverty and equality of women, the normal Millennium Development Goals. So what the United Nations got with the approval of the Millennium Development Goals was sort of to codify some major objectives of any developing country, including our own, and offer a roadmap on how to achieve them. So we've used the Millennium Development Goals. There's some magic in that, in having some objectives and quantitative objectives. We've come out with about triennial reports on how well we're doing or how badly we're doing in achieving all of the Millennium Development Goals, the major categories and also the subcategories.
Are there specific categories that Guatemala is focusing on? For example, when we talk about infant mortality or maternal health, is that an issue that Guatemala is tackling?
Yes, definitely. Guatemala, as you know, since you're a compatriot of mine, is one of the relatively poorest countries of Latin America. Not so poor in resources and not so poor in potential, but it's a country where we have very high incidence of poverty. So logically, what you want to do is, in the development process, to reduce the levels of poverty, to improve the livelihood of the population. And that takes you almost automatically into the areas of health, education, housing. And I might add that that is especially the areas where we've had the most progress. We've moved from a country with very high levels of illiteracy into a situation today where almost 100% of children of school age do go to schools. Maybe the quality of education isn't up to par, but at least now we have about 98% of our school-age children in school. About 75% of them finish the 6th grade, which is I would say, a dramatic improvement of where we were, say, 15 or 20 years ago. And the same type of achievements can be cited in the area of infant mortality, of maternal mortality, of life expectancy, and of combating the major transmittable disease. So those are the areas where we have really very good records to show. We've been less successful in lowering the incidence of poverty. We've moved in the right direction, but not at the same rate as we have in achieving the development goals in health and education. And we have other very serious problems which we can talk about. But in balance, we have these, what do you call it? Numeric values, which we want to achieve. And we've moved in that direction to a very considerable extent.
As you mentioned, certainly some of the progress that Guatemala certainly has done is with those specific topics of infant mortality and maternal health. Can you talk a little bit more about the initiatives that Guatemala is currently working on, or particular projects that they're working to address the issue?
Yes, well, some are direct investments in the infrastructure of education and health, especially in teacher training, in updating the curriculum. And the other are indirect policies, especially the programs of conditioned transfers meaning that the government offers a monetary subsidy to very poor families on the condition that their children have access to health care and to education. This has been a well-known policy in many Latin American countries. Brazil was probably the innovator. Mexico has had a very good experience. By now it's spread to almost all Latin American countries. And in Guatemala, it was started with the current administration quite successfully. And it covers now, I would say, about half of what we would consider the poorest segments of the Guatemalan society. They receive a monthly subsidy. It's not very much. It's about $45, the equivalent of 45 US dollars. And one of the consequences of that is that the population that assists both to the school system and the hospitals has increased enormously, to the point where our infrastructure is totally insufficient now to deal with the large increases, which should have been foreseen but really weren't. But anyway, there is a dramatic change there, and if I had to point to one single policy instrument, it would be the conditioned transfer program, which has been in balance very successful.
I think when you discuss, when you just mentioned now some of the challenges, certainly I think perhaps if you can address the disasters that Guatemala, the natural disasters that Guatemala has had to deal with in 2010, how much of that has impacted Guatemala in continuing to progress and move ahead?
Well, you're right. We've faced not only natural disasters, but also the financial crisis, which it hit all Latin America, but it affected the Caribbean basin countries much more because of their proximity to the United States and the impact of the financial crisis on those economies that depend on the US market, and Guatemala is among them. So the first disaster that hit us was really in the 2008-2009 financial crisis. We had been growing at rates of 5.5% to 6% a year in the previous 2 years, and growth plummeted to about 0.5%. And we're now climbing out of that hole at a very slow pace. We're growing now at about 2 or 2.5% a year, which is totally insufficient to absorb the people that enter the work market. So that was a first, and then we have natural disasters. First of all, we're in an earthquake zone, as you know. Luckily, we haven't had one now, a major earthquake in the last few years, but we have had tropical storms, one very serious one in 2005, and a second very serious one last year. Very serious. It caused enormous damage to the infrastructure. We still have not been able to repair it all. And it caused enormous damage to about 200,000 families which were displaced from their homes. So if you add to our efforts of achieving the Millennium Development Goals, the negative impact, first of the financial crisis and then this natural disaster of 2009, it explains in part why, at least in Guatemala, we can't talk only of progress, but really a mixed picture of the half glass empty, half glass full syndrome. We have had important achievements, but they're not enough, and we still have, at least by Latin American standards, a very high incidence of poverty and a very unequal income distribution.